Okay. Good morning. Good Erev Shabbos, Chodesh Tov. Next week, we have the privilege of celebrating Shavuos. And one of the key feature of Shavuos, of course, is Ma'amad Har Sinai and the giving of the Aseret HaDibros, the Ten Commandments. Very significant concept of the Ten Commandments. How many were there? Why these 10? It's repeated twice in the Torah, in Parshas Yisro and in Parshas Veschanan. And there are a number of fascinating questions that I want to ask. But before I get to the questions, just want to make an observation that the giving of the Ten Commandments at Har Sinai was, I believe, unique in the history of world religions. In most religions, the prophet or the lawgiver experienced some type of a revelation, if you will, theophany, up on a mountaintop or in a cave or in a desert. It happened between that individual who started his religion and whatever apparition he may have seen or felt or thought he saw. Unlike Judaism, in Judaism, God appeared to the entire Jewish people. It's the only religion that I know of where God appeared to well over 2 million people, 600,000 men with their wives and children. It's over 2 million people who experienced God's presence at Mount Sinai, who heard the giving of the Ten Commandments. They, of course, told their children about this wondrous experience. Their children told their children, and so forth until today. So unless we believe that every parent lied to his child over so many generations, this just kind of proves the truth of Judaism as opposed to all the other world religions where some individual came up with an idea claiming to have had a revelation or a theophany, God appeared to him. So I just want to make that observation that it's unique among world religions and that we still celebrate it today on Shavuos. So a bunch of questions. Why were these specific mitzvos given at Har Sinai? Are these 10 more important than any of the other mitzvos? Are we required to be more careful in our observance of these 10 as opposed to other mitzvos? Why these 10 were specifically given directly from God, whereas all the other mitzvos were given from Moshe? And by the way, I don't know if I'll get to answer all these questions. I have a lot of questions. Why were these mitzvos written on luchos as opposed to the other mitzvos which Moshe wrote in a Sefer Torah? In addition to which, every one of these 10 commandments is repeated elsewhere in the Torah, sometimes multiple times. For example, God took us out of Mitzrayim is repeated many times throughout the Torah. The prohibition against avodah zarah, worshiping other gods, is also repeated many, many times. Not using God's name in vain is repeated in Parshas Mishpatim. Shmira Shabbos is repeated many times. Respect for parents is repeated again in Parshas Kedoshim. The prohibition and the punishment for murder is repeated many, many times throughout the Torah. Adultery is mentioned several times. Not stealing is mentioned a number of times in Kedoshim. Prohibition against false testimony, Eidah Sheker, is given in Mishpatim as well. Not coveting, not being jealous of somebody else and what someone else has, is repeated in the Parshas Kisisa. So if it's so important, why these mitzvahs, which are repeated throughout the Torah? We'll try to get to some of these answers, but there's a lot of questions. Matan Torah, Shavuos, basically is the culmination of Pesach. Yetzias Mitzrayim's function was to bring us to Har Sinai. So, for example, what is the Talmudic name for Shavuos? Atzeres, which means conclusion. So it's one long yontif from Pesach until Shavuos, with the days of Sfira in between, but we're counting down or counting up, if you will, towards Shavuos, which is the culmination, the purpose of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why was Matan Torah, this occasion that we're going to celebrate this week, not used as an opportunity for Moshe to go deeper into the profound meaning of the Torah, as opposed to just talking about these 10? Now, trying to answer some of these questions. Number one, Chazal seem to indicate, and a lot of different Gemaras about this, that the 10 Commandments represents the entire Torah. Now, this could be symbolically, or this could be literally, as we'll see. As a matter of fact, there's a fantastic Gemara Yerushalmi. I want to read this to you. The Talmud Yerushalmi in the Maseches Sota, Paraches Mishnah Gimel, says as follows. Very interesting piece of Gemara. Keitzad hoyu haluchos ksuvim. How were the tablets written or engraved? Hananya ben Achi Rabbi Yeshua Omer. Hananya, Rabbi Yeshua's brother, says, Bein kol dibur v'dibur. In between each of the 10 commandments, diktukeha v'osioseha. All of the details, all the pratim, all the halachos relating to that dibur were written in between each of the 10 commandments. So either it was very small letters or they were very large luchos. But now, does this mean literally they were all written there, or perhaps Moshe explained them all? It's a fascinating Gemara. I don't know how to explain that. But symbolically, we understand that these 10 commandments are the basis of Judaism. The first 5, man adam lamakam, between man and God. And the second 5 between adam lachavero, between man and his fellow man. And it's perhaps you can say it's a condensed version of all 613 mitzvos, which flow out from these. The Midrash says there are 620 letters in the Aseres HaDibros, 613 mitzvos, 7 days of creation. What those two have together, I'm not sure. Moshe was, now it's interesting, many different sources indicate that Moshe was given the entire Torah, not just the 10 Commandments, on Har Sinai. And it took 40 days for him to absorb it all, which is why he was a little bit late coming down, which led to the golden calf, unfortunately. But to learn all 613 mitzvos and all the pratim, which he then, for the next number of years, several decades, taught to Bnei Yisrael, because the Dibros were the framework for all 113 mitzvos. He came down with the luchos, these 2 stone tablets. Again, we're not sure how big. We once figured out how big they were, how heavy they were. If all the pratim were written in between, it must have been very, very heavy. Rashi is bothered by the fact that Moshe didn't come down with the Sefer Torah. He only came down with the luchos. So he answers his own question by stating, as we've mentioned before, which is the general view of Chazal, that all 613 mitzvos are included in the Aseret Dibur, or they flow from it. As a matter of fact, Rashi quotes Rav Sadia Gaon, who writes, and if you look in his book called Asharos of Sadia Gaon, he shows from the 10 Commandments how all 613 mitzvos are derived. Very creative. He figures out all 613 commandments are some way connected to those 10 commandments. Now, because those 10 lead to 613, Hashem wanted to speak to Bnei Israel directly, not through Moshe. Then later on, it was left to Moshe to explain all of these things. Again, if you look at Rav Saadia Gaon, it's the words have multiple meanings and interpretations. Interestingly, the Ksava Kabbalah writes that the luchos, it quotes the Gemara, the luchos could be read from both directions. In other words, it wasn't engraved on the stone tablets, it was cut through, but you could read it from both sides. That was one of the nisim of the Aseret Dibros. You could read the 10 Commandments from both sides, even though it was cut straight through. How that worked, I'm not quite sure, but this is what the Gemara says. Now, what does that mean? It can be read from both sides. So the Gemara asked that same question, and it alludes to the fact that there is a simple meaning of the text, but a deeper meaning of the text, which you can read in many, many different ways. Maybe it was a code. And when the luchos were broken, when Moshe saw the Egel HaZahav, then this particular code of interpretation may have been lost. Which is why perhaps it answers one of the questions we raised before, that the Aseret Dibros are repeated elsewhere in the Torah. It was a concentrated version, and then you had to repeat certain mitzvos, because after the luchos were broken, the interpretive code, if you will, was lost. Each of the Aseret Dibros has a separate theme. We mentioned the first 5, second 5, if you want to analyze each one, Anochi, I am the Lord your God, took you out of Mitzrayim, means we accept Hashem's dominion, Hashem's rulership, because he made us into a people. He took us out of Mitzrayim. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Now know that I am the Lord your God. Prohibiting idolatry represents God's demand, if you will, for absolute loyalty, not to anyone or anything else. God is a jealous God. I'm your God. I did all these things for you. Therefore, I demand loyalty. And therefore, you can't worship any other gods, whether it's graven images or stones or whatever. Not using God's name in vain represents basically how you show respect to the king, not to desecrate his name. He is the King of Kings, and therefore you treat his name with a great deal of respect. Shabbos is fascinating because you have 2 different languages. We said it, we're going to say it tonight in L'chadodi. Shama v'zachar b'dibur echad. Hishmi anu kel hamyuchad. Zachar and Shomar was said simultaneously, and that's how the people heard it. Now, again, just to mention parenthetically, when the Torah says God spoke, God doesn't speak the way I'm speaking to you now, the way people speak. It's a mistranslation. God doesn't speak. God communicates. There's a big difference. Speech is oral, comes through your mouth, your vocal cords. God didn't speak to Bnei Israel. God communicated, which is the only way you can understand how he could say Shamar and Zachar at the exact same time. In Shmos, it says Shamar, and Zachar, and in Dvarim, it says Shamar. When they repeat the Aseret Dibros and Parshas Veschanan, different languages used. Shamar v'Zachar b'dibur echad, as we say in L'chadodi. He said them both at the same time. Shamar means he took us out of Mitzrayim. This is his I guess, hashgacha, his providence. And Shamar has to do with the fact, I'm sorry, the other way around. Zachar has to do with the fact that Hashem rested on Shabbos from creation. That's our recognition of Hashem as the Borei Olam. And Shamar is based on the fact they took us out of Mitzrayim, and therefore, similarly, it's not appropriate for a slave to determine what day he's going to work or not. Only through God's command are we told not to work or do malacha on Shabbos. So that's one interpretation of Zachar and Shamar, two aspects of Shabbos. But Hashem said it simultaneously, or he communicated it simultaneously, and Bnei Yisrael heard Zachar and Shamar at the same time. Okay. Kibud Av V'Eim represents our connection to the Masorah. We accept what our parents teach us. As I mentioned at the very beginning, generation after generation told that story. We were there at Sinai. 2 million people experienced God's presence, God's communicating the Ten Commandments. They told their children, and so on until today. And that's Kibud Av V'Eim, respect for the Masorah handed to us by our parents. Not to murder perhaps represents our obligation to be concerned about other people's bodies. You don't take a life because you don't create life. It's respect for human life. Also, not stealing teaches us respect for other people's property. Not committing adultery is a combination of things that are aspects of guf and momo. When a couple gets married, the ishtoka gufo, there's an actual kinyan that takes place, and they are as if they are one, so to speak. So it's an obligation to be concerned about guf and mammon as well. Not testifying falsely in terms of concern about how we speak, speech in general, not just testimony, not just lying, but in general, the type of language that we use. Unfortunately, we live in a society where inappropriate language is commonplace. You find certain words now that are used in print and on television that you never heard uttered in polite society before, and it's acceptable. So this is, I think, an important aspect that we should understand in terms of how one speaks. Lashon Nakiya, that Jews should speak in an appropriate way. And of course, not to covet, not to be jealous of what other people have, means to be concerned for other people, not just how we treat them, but even the way we think about them. Not to be achas b'peh v'achas b'alev. Not to be, contradictory in how we behave outwardly, but inwardly we think differently. We should not be jealous of what other people have, and that this is a very important obligation, to be concerned not only in deed but in thought of how we deal with other people. Okay, if you look in Parshas Yisro and Parshas Va'eschanan, there are significant differences in how the Ten Commandments are repeated in those two parshios. In Yisro, we mentioned already, it says Zochar es Yom HaShabbos. In Va'eschanan, it says Shamar. In Va'eschanan, it adds, in terms of Shabbos, it says Kasher Tzivcha. And it adds Shorcha v'Chamorcha. Not only you, but your livestock also can't be worked on Shabbos. In Parshas Yisro, the reason for Shabbos is Brias Ha'olam, the creation of the world. In V'eschanan, it commemorates Yetzias Mitzrayim. Think about it tonight when you make Kiddush. You have both of those concepts. Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim and Brias Ha'olam are incorporated into the Kiddush. Again, technical language. In Parshas Yisro, it says 8 sheker, false witnesses. In V'eschanan, it says 8 shav, which is a different connotation. Don't bear, it's not just false witness, it's lying about witnessing something. In Yisro, it says not to covet eshes reyecha, your friend's wife. V'eschanan, it says beis reyecha, his house, meaning his possessions. Lo sachmod versus lo sisave. In Parshas Yisro, it doesn't mention sadehu, your fields, whereas in V'eschanan it does. So there are a lot of interpretive difference in the language. It would be a worthwhile exercise this Shabbos in preparation for Shavuos to review the Ten Commandments in Parshas Yisro, and to review it again in Parshas Eschanan to note the differences, some subtle, some much more overt, in preparation for hearing this Kriya on Shavuos. One of the Mefarshim, Ibn Ezra, explains that the Aseret Adibros in Parshas Yisro are the way it was written on the luchos, on the tablets, and the way that Hashem communicated them at Har Sinai. The Dibros in Parshas Eschanan contains the way they are to, Moshe explained them, and the way they are to be understood. Torah Shebeksav, Torah Shebapeh, if you will. Okay, let's see. All right, there are a few other minor differences that you'll notice. The Greene, Ksiv. Okay, there are some halachos I want to mention very briefly about the reading and the significance of the Aseret Dibros. First of all, in the Beis Hamikdash, before you had a structured siddur, which came much later, the Mishnah mentions that they used to read the Aseret Dibros in the Beis Hamikdash as part of the daily avoda, part of the daily service to the Kohanim. Eventually, it was abolished. Why? Because people were concerned that this is the most important part of the Torah, and they wouldn't study the rest of the Torah, or they wouldn't respect it as much. So because you might be concerned about certain heresy, that this is the most important, or the only important part of the Torah, which is why it was selected to be read in the Beis Hamikdash, so they stopped reading it. So it shouldn't cause questions to arise. Rashi says that these were the uneducated people, but unfortunately the masses are uneducated, and Chazal decided better err on the side of caution. How do we read the Aseret Dibros? First of all, we all stand. Now, there are many people who stand for the entire Kriyas HaTorah, which is probably appropriate, because what is it when it talks about the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai? The Torah says, "Vayis yadsfu," they stood at the foot of the mountain. Bnei Yisrael all stood when Hashem gave the Torah to them. So, based on that and other sources, many people are accustomed to stand during the entire Kriyas HaTorah. After all, Kriyas HaTorah is essentially God speaking to us. So we stand, the way they did at Har Sinai. But especially the minhag is widespread that whether you stand or sit for normal Kriyas HaTorah on Shabbos, everybody stands for the Aseret Dibros. Not only that, but it's not read in the regular trup. There are two types of musical notes, cantillation notes for the Torah, what they call tam tachton and tam elyon. If you look in a chumash, you'll notice the musical notes that the Baal Koreh reads or learns the trup from is underneath the letters, under the words. But there's a certain something called tam elyon, where there are musical notes written above the text. And that is the tune that is used when they read the Aseret Dibros. And each dibur is read as a separate pasuk. And this commemorates the Matan Torah experience. There are some people who were accustomed in generations in the past that when you would normally read the Aseret Dibros in Parshas Yisro and in Parshas Eschanan, they would read the regular trup, and they would only read Tam Elyon on Shavuos. We don't do that anymore. The Mishnah Berurah says very clearly that the minhag today is whenever you read the Aseret Dibros, you read them in a Tam Elyon. So hopefully, this Shavuos, when you hear the Aseret Dibros, perhaps some of these questions can bother you enough to investigate a little bit further. And as we stand up, we try to recapture that Shavuos experience. Again, every time we hear Kriyas HaTorah, it's as if Hashem is speaking to us. which is essentially what it is. And we stay up all night on Shavuos to anticipate eagerly the giving of the Torah. We learn Torah, and we express our desire to be makabel the Torah the same way, or the same enthusiasm as our ancestors did at Mount Sinai when they said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do, we will observe, we will listen, and hopefully it'll inspire us to keep studying, not only answer some of these questions, but to go deeper into the Taryag mitzvos as well throughout the year. So that's a little introduction to the Aseret HaDibros on Shavuos. Any questions, comments?
Thank you. Have a great Shabbos.
Okay. Have a
Wally,
wonderful Shabbos and a great Yontif.
Wally.
Yes.